Bibliophiles of the internet, today I'm here to share my Queer Lit Readathon wrap-up. If you don't know, for some reason, the Queer Lit Readathon has two main rounds every year. It was created by my friends Kathy and Rogan with the goal of motivating people to read nothing but queer books for a week, a weekend, a month, whatever the time frame may be. It was more of a modest round for me this month, but I still think I did pretty well. But also, this round just happened to kick off during one of the busiest, most stressful weeks of my entire year, and I couldn't start reading until like Tuesday or Wednesday, which really made me sad. So I decided to exercise my fictional authority as a former Queer Lit Readathon host and give myself 2 extra days. And that's canon, baby. It doesn't even matter how you feel about it. There's literally nothing you can do because I can do whatever I want. All of that said, let's just get into it, starting with my arc of OkCupid by Mason Deaver. This review copy was kindly sent to me by Push Scholastic, and it comes out very soon actually, on January 2nd, so not too long to wait. This is a contemporary YA romance with just a smidgen of magic. We're following Jude, who's trans non-binary and also happens to be a Cupid. Their literal job is to help humans fall in love, find romantic bliss, etc., by tweaking the circumstances a little bit. However, they're still recovering from their last disastrous assignment when they accidentally got romantically involved with a human themselves, which is strictly forbidden. But now Jude is getting ready to get back into the field, and they've been given their first long-term assignment where they will pose as a high school student for a month in order to reunite these two feuding best friends / former date mates. Content warnings for some mentions of parental estrangement, some experiences of misgendering, and some descriptions of a sports-related injury. Like I said, Jude is trans non-binary, and their love interest, Huy, is a trans boy himself, so it's a T for T romance, and also he's a Vietnamese immigrant. This was really fun to read. I feel like in their 2 most recent books, Mason has just been allowing themselves to write these unapologetically joyful and tropey T for T romances, which are so incredibly needed in the YA space. Their first 2 books explore really important topics like disownment and grief, especially for young queer people. But just like we need those stories, we also need cutesy stories like these. Maybe cutesy is a slight oversell. It is Mason after all. The story does go to some philosophical, emotional places. This story is like a romantic comedy of errors. The more Jude tries to get Huy and Alice back together, the more they start accidentally inserting themselves into the situation. The chemistry between Jude and Huy is undeniable, but Jude is determined to act like nothing is happening because they're so terrified of failing as a Cupid again. And that, coupled with the trauma of what happened on their last assignment, really has Jude questioning what it even means to be a Cupid in the first place. How do they know whether this is actually their calling in life or merely just the circumstances they were born into? I love that even though the story is not overtly about transness, despite centering a romance between 2 trans characters, the metaphor of being a Cupid, being either trapped by the circumstances and expectations assigned to you or daring to imagine what life can look like beyond what you've always known, is directly applicable to transness. That's definitely the central question of the story. Is it better to stick with the sure thing in life and do things the way they're quote-unquote supposed to be done? Or is it worth it to dive headfirst into the unknown, to trust that you're strong enough to figure things out? It's a really great question, especially for teen audiences who this book is intended for, and I appreciate how the story explores those ideas. I also love the implication that platonic love is worth fighting for just as much as romantic love. Because even though it's very obvious that Huy and Alice are not in love with each other, despite Jude's assignment, this never gets flagged by the Cupid Association or whoever's in charge, because there is a love worth saving there. But it's not romantic love, it's love between friends. My only major note about the story is that I think there was even more space to play with Cupid magic, and I think that would have made the story even more exciting and delightfully chaotic. The opening scene establishes some of the basic qualities of Jude's Cupid magic, but it's never really used again after that. And while I don't think that magic should have been used for everything because that would collapse the stakes of the story, I wanted to see it more. I would have loved to see how it might backfire on Jude or make a messy situation situation even messier or more awkward, especially because it's really easy to forget that Jude is actually a Cupid. I would argue that you could have swapped out the Cupid bit for Jude being some kind of teenage matchmaker, or Jude having to get these people back together because of a bet or something. And even with one of those substitutions, I think the story would have been virtually unchanged, which to me signals that there was more world building to be done. I'm also not really sure how I feel about the ending because it's neither an HEA, happily ever after, or an HFN, happy for now. It's definitely hopeful, which I appreciate, but it's a bit too ambiguous for my taste, especially when it comes to a romance, which has pretty set conventions in that specific case. But there was still a lot about this I enjoyed overall, and in the end I gave it a very strong 4 stars. In terms of the bingo board, I was able to fulfill 3 prompts with this book. The choose your own prompt, which for me was review copy, most recently acquired, and holiday, because it's set around both the Vietnamese New Year and, appropriately, Valentine's. After that, I finally listened to the Borrow a Boyfriend Club by Paige Powers. I was granted access to the audiobook courtesy of PRH Audio, and the audiobook is read by the phenomenal Christian Banas. This is another contemporary rom-com about a trans boy named Noah who recently transferred schools and just wants people to see him for the boy he truly is. So his master plan to be gendered correctly at his new school is to join the most masculine-sounding after-school club he can find, which is why he signs up for this de facto Italian club dedicated to football and Lamborghinis. But when he gets there, he realizes it's actually an elaborate front for something called the Borrow a Boyfriend Club, where students can basically choose from a roster of guys to rent a date for school dances, family events, holidays, parties. Noah thinks this is great because if he's accepted into a club where he's seen as a dateable boy, then that's the best possible outcome. However, the club president Asher is a real stickler and extremely picky about who joins the club. If Noah wants to get in, he will have to prove his skills as a boyfriend and go through a series of tests that include romancing Asher himself. Content warnings for explorations of transphobia, both internal and external, misgendering, and dead naming, and also some explorations of parental estrangement. Noah is trans, as I said, and Asher is actually pan, or at the very least gender indifferent when it comes to his romantic relationships. First of all, as I've said before, this book is literally so aggressively Oran High School Host Club coded. If you know, you know, and if you love Oran, you will love this. If you suspend your disbelief, which is not hard to do, by the way, about this club of teenage boys running an underground rent-a-date business right under the school's nose, then you will have a great time with this, I guarantee. I say this as a compliment, but you can tell Paige Powers is a shit poster because the entire story absolutely radiates that energy. I have not laughed so hard at such delightfully ridiculous scenarios in such a long time. And before I forget, the audiobook is incredible. Christian Banas is an absolute gift. You can tell he's done professional voice acting specifically for animation because animated is absolutely how I would describe his narration. He's personable, he's emotive, he's fun, he fully commits to the moment, whether it's something big or something quiet. The audiobook was such a great listen. It really reminded me of how I felt listening to The Best at It by Malik Pancholi, who's a professional actor and voice actor who narrates his own audiobooks himself, and has those same qualities that makes his story so engaging to listen to and really brings so much depth to the listening experience. Anyways, back to the story. This was just an utter delight in every imaginable way. It's funny, it's endearing, it has a great cast of characters who just radiate chaos and also gentle masculinity. The romance is wonderful as well. I wouldn't even call it grumpy sunshine, it's more like grumpy idiot. If idiots to lovers was a trope, which I actually firmly believe it is, then this would definitely fit in that vein. But besides being equal parts hilarious and heartfelt, I also really connected with Noah, who's so strongly fixated on proving himself as a boy and proving his masculinity, often only concerning himself with how he comes off in other people's eyes. There's actually a lot of nuance in how the story explores this urge that trans mass people have to divorce themselves from any traces of femininity, whether that's in their body language, their vocal affectations, their style, or their interests, so that people will see them as not girl at the very least. But But then the story interrogates what we lose by doing that. By willfully narrowing down the scope of our lives and our genders to fit into an accepted binary, a binary that's all too often defined by entirely arbitrary rules and limitations that are often defined by colonization, in what ways does that actually do us a disservice and continue to uphold this stark divide between how men are allowed to exist and how women are allowed to exist, to say nothing of those of us who exist either between or beyond? In that way, I think Noah actually has a lot of internalized transphobia. He sees how his fellow club members do things like wear makeup, wear quote-unquote girls' clothes, grow out their hair in longer styles, etc. And he never once questions the authenticity of their boyhood, but he's unable to extend himself that nuance and that grace. One of the ways the story explores that is in how Noah is supposed to be helping the club win this talent show, and so he's helping them choreograph a dance. But he actually gave up dance when he transitioned because he could only associate the experience and sensation of dance with his past body and his past self. So he's dreading this talent show. He's like, oh my god, I'm gonna dance and everyone's gonna know I was raised as a girl. It's gonna be so obvious to everyone. Not even realizing the cognitive dissonance in that line of thinking when he's literally gonna be on stage with 3 or 4 cis boys whose gender is not gonna be compromised by the act of dancing. So why would his? And the story does a great job of establishing those emotional stakes for Noah. He had some not great experiences at his old school when he transitioned. He's very obviously insecure about his own gender through no fault of his own, and even his parents cause him to doubt himself sometimes. Even though his parents are really supportive on paper, they do these little things like never actually calling him Noah that adds to this burning need he feels to prove himself and show that he's enough. And I really love how all of that builds to this realization that other people's approval and acceptance is never actually going to make Noah feel like he's enough or that he's boy enough. The only person who can give him that acceptance he so desperately craves is himself. I had such a great time listening to this. Like I said, it's fun, it's camp, it really makes a meal out of these over-the-top, ridiculous shenanigans, but at the same time, it also explores a lot of complex and worthwhile ideas that I think are very much worth centering. I would absolutely recommend this, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Going back to the bingo board, I counted this for 2 prompts. First, escape, because listening to this audiobook was a nice little escapist experience, I think, and also relatable, because even though personally I'm not a trans man, I definitely found this a little too #relatable at times. After that, on a whim, I decided I should pick up a graphic novel, which led me to North Ranger by Ray Terciero and Brie Indigo. This is a contemporary reimagining of Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey, but told as a somewhat spooky teen romance with a Latina main character and set on a ranch in small-town Texas. The story is about a closeted Latina teenager named Cade who is obsessed with horror movies, but he knows that being queer in rural Texas is much scarier than any of those stories. His summer is completely upended when his parents volunteer him to work as a ranch hand in order to help earn some extra money for the family. But as much as Cade is not cut out for the ranch life, luckily the owner of the ranch has 2 teenage twins around his age. But of course, it's the son, Henry, who catches Cade's attention most, and as they start slowly spending more time together, they start falling for one another and they initiate a little bit of a secret romance. But things get complicated pretty quickly when Cade realizes there's a lot about his past that Henry won't open up about, and he's not sure whether their budding relationship will be able to survive the weight of these secrets. Content warnings for experienced homophobia and racism, including the use of racial slurs, some explorations of parental death and grief, physical assault, near instances of child abuse, depictions of alcoholism, allusions to animal death, and some references to suicidal thoughts and attempts. I have not read Northanger Abbey, and I absolutely don't think you need to be familiar with the original story to fully enjoy and appreciate this. In fact, reading this made me actually consider reading Northanger Abbey for the first time at some point, which I think is a huge testament to how this retelling is such a success. This was such a pleasant surprise, because even though it's recontextualizing this classic story in pretty significant ways, both culturally and in terms of the setting, it's still able to capture those creepy, sinister, gothic vibes within the framework of a contemporary romance. I also feel like this would be a great book to tandem read with It Came from the Closet, because a lot of the queer theory surrounding horror movies that's being explored in that nonfiction anthology is actually being put into practice in this fictional story. Because Cade relates so strongly to scary movies, that informs the way he carries himself and the way he sees the world. Coupled with the fact that he's been raised in rural Texas where he always has to look over his shoulder and actively fear how people might engage with his queerness, it makes all the sense in the world that he tends to lead not just with suspicion, but more specifically with cautiousness. In that sense, I love what the story is doing thematically, because Henry especially is grappling with some really difficult secrets, and because he hasn't figured out if or how he wants to share those with Cade, that feeling of not knowing leads Cade to jump to his own conclusions and almost sabotage their entire relationship before it even starts. It connects back to a lot of what's explored in It Came from the Closet, because this story is working to deconstruct the false connection between queerness and monstrosity, at least in a negative context. It holds up a mirror to how queer people are more inclined to see ourselves as the monster, to see people in our own communities as the monster, before stepping back and realizing that it's actually the constructs and widespread effects of homophobia and bigotry themselves that are monstrous. So overall, I thought this was really great. It's beautifully illustrated in a way that makes you feel grounded in the ranch and the lake house, which are the two predominant settings. It's emotionally evocative, there's a really sweet romance, and even some mystery vibes as well, which make it really fun to read. My one main critique is that I wish there was some more exploration of Cade's family dynamic. There's definitely tension between him and his stepdad that we see coming to the forefront, but I wish the story had gone further in exploring how the family's financial hardships place an unfair onus on Cade to quote-unquote pull his weight. Even though Cade is a teenager, he's a literal child, and at the beginning of the story it's implied that his very existence is a burden to his parents, and therefore he must take this summer job and do something to fix it himself. Now, I'm not saying that's an unrealistic or uncommon experience in any way, but we could have stood to see more of the emotional impact from that choice. But that's a really small note. Overall, I still really enjoyed this. I immediately ordered a physical copy after finishing it because I enjoyed it that much, and I gave it 4.5 stars. For the bingo board, this one counted towards graphic novel, of course, also librarian rec because I saw this as part of a library display at one point, and also small town queers because it's set on a ranch in small town Texas. And finally, I read one of the group books, which was You Exist Too Much by Zaina Arafat. This is a piece of queer adult realistic fiction. It's about an unnamed bisexual Palestinian-American woman who has always felt judged by her family and her culture. Now that she's out and independent, living in New York as a DJ with her first serious girlfriend, she tries to assure herself that she's finally content. But soon, all of those feelings she repressed growing up start showing through the cracks, namely with her destructive tendencies to engage in reckless, obsessive romantic affairs with other people outside of her relationship, which she believes is due to an addiction of some kind. So she checks herself into this long-term rehabilitation program that will treat her love addiction, and by finally sifting through her memories that span from the US to the Middle East, she will finally start to confront the similarities between her actions and the internal traumas and divisions she's both experienced and inflicted upon herself. Content warnings for experienced sexism and homophobia, witness misogyny, allusions to past experiences with eating disorders as well as recovery, descriptions of infidelity, some references to drug abuse, some explorations of domestic abuse, child abuse, and verbal abuse, brief instance of self-harm, expressions of Islamophobia and Zionism, and some sexual content. You know I'm always going to be jazzed out of my mind when I get to read about messy, destructive, disastrous queer characters, especially if they're BIPOC, especially if they're multiply marginalized in any way, because those are exactly the kinds of people who get vilified the most. And oh boy, is the main character in this story a doozy when it comes to being a walking disaster. Her instinct is to always make the worst possible choice when it comes to her relationships and the way she engages in various forms of intimacy. It's almost like she's programmed to self-destruct any potentially meaningful relationship in her life. The story is really a deep dive into the emotional circumstances and intergenerational traumas that have contributed to the formation of those destructive instincts. As this character is receiving treatment for what she sees as an addiction, she's remembering these pivotal relationships and moments. In that sense, I love the way the story is structured and pieced together. The main character might be exploring something in treatment or being invited to reflect on some kind of healing-related question, and then the story will flash back to something that happened in her life that actually contributed to where she is now, even though at the time it may have seemed innocuous. So I love that layered storytelling because it mimics how these small moments reverberate throughout the entirety of a person's life, how the past is still very much happening to us in the present, even when we can't name those discrepancies. Related to that, I can really respect how this story both is and is not about Palestinian identity. It's very much not interested in extolling the virtues of Palestinians for the benefit of the audience, which it absolutely does not have to. At the same time, the main character's cultural identity is definitely on the peripheral edges of the story, especially in regards to how her mother's experience as a Palestinian refugee went on to shape how she raised the main character, which obviously has had a long-lasting impact. And there's also a metaphorical connection to Palestine through the themes of the story as well, especially for the Palestinian diaspora, most of whom are either descended from refugees or refugees themselves, not by choice, but by circumstance. The concept of homeland can be extremely challenging, not only because there have been so many successful attempts to colonize and delegitimize Palestine as a country, but also because they're not allowed to have a physical or material connection to their homeland even if they wanted to. And again, even though the story isn't about the main character traveling back to her literal homeland of Palestine, it is about the various ways she's constantly seeking out the feeling of homeland throughout her life, and how she's also denied access to those forms of homeland because of her trauma and the way those traumas influence her choices. In this case, the homeland that she's physically, emotionally, spiritually unable to inhabit is love itself. She is ceaselessly searching for the kinds of love that her family always denied to her, an unconditional kind of love that she both craves and deeply fears. And every time she gets close to it, she self-sabotages so that she'll never know the experience of having or inhabiting that kind of love. So overall, the story is chaotic. It's almost purposefully frustrating to read in some ways, as the main character keeps making the same mistakes over and over again, but worse and worse each time. The narration is very matter-of-fact, borderline detached, but still very emotionally dialed in, I would say. I would absolutely read more from this author in the future, and I gave this 4 stars. Going back to the bingo board one last time, this one counted for the group reads prompt, obviously, and the small press prompt, because I realized this was published through Catapult here in the US, which is an independent press. So I got 1 diagonal bingo and 1 bingo across the bottom row, which I think is pretty good for a week's work. So those are all the books I read for this past round of the Queer Lit Readathon. As always, if you've read any of them yourself, if you have thoughts on any of these, if you want to share how your own reading went this past round, I would love to talk to you about all of those things down below in the comments. That is everything I had to share for today. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.